Washington, D.C., the 15th of August, 1971. The studio lights are a hard, white bright enough to feel like truth. One man looks straight into the camera, speaks about stability and responsibility, then announces a decision that sounds like a technical adjustment. America will temporarily stop exchanging dollars for gold. On paper, it's closing a valve. In the system, it's pulling the pin. On the other side of the screen, the world doesn't hear metal hit the floor. They only see the number. A dollar is still a dollar. But once the anchor is gone, what's left is habit, fear, and dependence. Monetary power doesn't need gunfire. It needs one thing everyone must buy just to live normally. In a moment, you're going to see how that required thing gets chosen. 2 years later, the Middle East ignites. 1,000. 973 to 1,000. 974 war, then an oil embargo. Energy prices spike like a heartbeat in an emergency room. Oil-importing countries stare at their foreign reserves the way you stare at an oxygen tank when the needle drops. Every barrel is another stack of dollars burned to keep the lights on, the cars moving, the factories from going silent. This stops being about price. It becomes about survival. And right at the point that seems purely physical fuel, ships, pipelines, something invisible starts to show itself. The oil bill is written in dollars. When oil is quoted and traded largely in USD, a country that needs oil needs dollars before it even needs the tanker. It has to earn them, hold them, stockpile them, not because it loves America, but because it fears tomorrow's payment with an empty hand. Early 1974, Washington and Riyadh accelerate technical cooperation, a joint commission. But in systems of power, technical is often the polite name for an arrangement. Petrodollar's vast rivers of dollars flowing into oil-exporting states swell through the late 1970 seconds, then circle back. They move through international banks, into dollar assets, and park in U.S. Treasury debt. A cold, closed loop. Energy becomes liquidity, and liquidity becomes power. If you want to understand why the dollar survived after it lost gold, don't start with speeches. Start with the oil invoice, and with where the surplus dollars are stored. Once you see that flow, you'll understand exactly where power begins. The studio lights of 1971 went out, but their shadow stayed. The thesis of this file is simple. After the gold anchor was gone, the dollar wasn't saved by some miracle of economics. It was kept alive by something far more practical. A payment system the entire world is forced to step into if it wants modern life to keep running. Our map has 3 stops, and each stop leaves a fingerprint. Stop 1 is the backdrop. When the gold window closed, America lost its hardest promise. The world had to live inside a new order, where trust no longer clung to metal, but to a network. And a network doesn't have to be perfect. It only has to be large enough that leaving it would feel like cutting off your own air. Stop 2 is the money trail. This is where the story shifts, color, from politics to accounting. Oil, traded largely in dollars, creates a mandatory demand for USD. Oil-importing countries have to accumulate dollars to pay the invoice. Oil-exporting countries receive dollar surpluses. And because they can't absorb all those dollars inside their domestic economies, the surplus has to flow back into the international financial system, into bank deposits, into assets, and especially into U.S. Treasury securities. The IMF calls it petrodollar recycling, a phrase that sounds clean, but in practice it's the process of turning energy revenue into financial strength for the issuer of the settlement currency. Stop 3 is the fracture in the bill. When the USD vacuum runs smoothly, it looks like stability. But once interest rates surge in the late 1970 seconds and early 1980 seconds. The cost of dollar debt for borrowers jumps, and the vacuum starts to behave like a tightening machine. Countries that borrowed to cover oil bills discover the real trap. They weren't only buying energy, they were renting liquidity under a contract whose terms can change. At the end of this journey, we don't find any mystical treaty. This file has to admit something plainly. The story of a secret pact forcing Saudi Arabia to sell oil only in dollars is heavily disputed, and without the document in hand, it belongs more to political myth than legal evidence. What matters is the practice on the ground. Oil is priced in dollars, reserves are managed in dollars, and surpluses are stored in dollar assets. Now the map is on the table, and we can start building the stage of power where everyone has something to lose, and that's exactly why everyone can be locked in. After the valve shut on the 15th of August, 1971, the stage of power had to be rebuilt around a human need, survival, and a reason strong enough for the system to keep running. America slipped off the gold handcuffs, but it couldn't slip off the other burden. If the world no longer had a natural reason to hold dollars, then the dollar would have to manufacture one. And that reason wouldn't come from slogans. It would come from the one thing every country has to buy. Oil importers entered the 1,970 seconds with a new fear. Without energy, factories go dark. Without dollars, energy goes dark too. The 1,973, 1,974 shock turned foreign reserves into a second kind of fuel burn just to keep the lights on. Finance ministers weren't only calculating the price of oil. They were calculating how many days the economy could still breathe if the dollar flow choked. In a moment, you'll see how that fear hardens into discipline. Stockpiling dollars the way you stockpile oxygen. On the exporting side, it looks like victory, but it carries a quiet trap. Petrodollars swell, flood into national coffers like a tide. But a domestic economy can't absorb unlimited surplus dollars without paying for it in distortion. So the money has to park somewhere else. International banks, foreign assets, safe paper. Here's the twist. The seller's surplus turns the seller into a tenant inside the very system that holds their wealth. Then, a third character steps into frame. International banks and Wall Street, the ones who don't need to own oil, only the pipeline. When petrodollars arrive as deposits, they become credit. Syndicated loans start flowing to oil-importing countries short on dollars. On the surface, it looks like liquidity relief. Underneath, it's a long contract where exchange rate risk and interest rate risk sit on the borrower's side. Power decides who gets to breathe first. Inside that picture, U.S. Saudi cooperation from mid-1974 onward through the Joint Commission looks like an operating framework. Economics, technical assistance, projects. Neutral words that really mean one thing. Stability, on conditions, contracts, services, and cash flows cycling back through Western systems turn an energy relationship into a financial relationship measured in dollars. And there's a fog every honest file has to walk through carefully. The story of a formal official treaty forcing Saudi Arabia to sell oil only in dollars. Many analyses argue it's overstated if you treat it as a legal document. In this case, there's no room to assert that text exists without a source. What we can say with more confidence is the practice. Oil is largely traded in dollars, and that practice is strong enough to create reserve habits even without a stamp. Power doesn't always need written law. Sometimes it only needs the exit cost to be too high. Put the actors on the table and each one has a weakness. America is weak where it must sustain global demand for its currency. Oil importers are weak because they must pay the invoice in money they cannot print. Oil exporters are weak because their surplus dollars must find a home, and that home is usually inside a system designed by someone else. Banks and bond markets are strong because they sit in the middle, charge the toll, and decide the speed of the flow. The stage's fatal vulnerability comes down to one fact. When oil and dollars share the same airway, whoever controls the liquidity valve can trigger panic without firing a shot. And to see how that valve gets turned, we have to follow the money right now from the oil invoice to the place it goes to sleep. Let's start where power looks the most harmless, an invoice. A tanker docks. No one on that deck can see a monetary system. They see barrels, the smell of fuel, and the final number that has to be paid. But at that exact moment, the mechanism tightens around your throat. Oil is quoted and traded mostly in US dollars, which means before you can buy energy, you have to buy dollars. A country can have factories, workers, ports, everything. But without USD, it's an economy standing outside the store, staring at a sign that says, cash only. So the first link isn't in the desert. It's inside the foreign exchange reserves. An oil-importing central bank has to hold dollars the way a wooden city keeps fire extinguishers everywhere, hoping never to use them, knowing that without them you die. And when 1,973 for 1,974 drove oil prices up like a heartbeat in panic, many countries were forced to burn reserves just to survive the energy bill. Here, power doesn't need to persuade you. It only needs you to need it. This is where the pressure goes. But reserves don't reproduce on their own. There are only 3 ways to get dollars: export to earn them, sell assets to obtain them, or borrow to cover the gap. And after the oil shock, the third option becomes more common than any speech wants to admit. When the energy bill explodes, the balance of payments rips like armor with a cracked seam, and oil importers enter global capital markets like someone walking a dark corridor holding a debt note in place of a flashlight. On the surface, it's finance. Underneath, it's survival. Here's the retention trigger of this file. In this system, you don't lose when you lose a battle. You lose when you run out of USD. This is where the pressure goes. The second link sits on the other side of the invoice. The oil seller receives surplus dollars, petrodollars. And here's the coldest paradox. A surplus that's too large is also a problem. Flood your domestic economy with excess USD and you pay for it in imbalance, inflation pressure, and a country reshaped by hot money. So the surplus has to leave the border and find shelter. Money doesn't have a homeland. Money has a safe place. And in the 1,970 seconds, safe usually had two shapes: the balance sheets of international banks and the debt paper of the US government. From 1974 to 1981, petrodollars swell and begin the journey back toward the center. No one has to slam a gavel and order it. The flow finds the shortest path to deep liquidity and standard assets. Retention trigger number 2. Money doesn't need a treaty. It needs an exit. This is where the pressure goes. The third link is the banking pipeline. Petrodollars enter international banks as deposits, and deposits in a bank's hands don't sit still, they become credit. Now the story changes voice. This is no longer about buying oil. It's about who gets to borrow USD to pay for oil. Syndicated loans become the bridge between surplus and shortage. Money from the seller flows through the bank and reaches the buyer who's desperate for dollars. On the surface, this recycling loop looks balanced. Surpluses get reinvested, deficits get funded, but every mechanism has a fee, and every fee carries power. Banks in the middle don't just move money, they price risk, set conditions, choose maturities, and most importantly, decide who can access dollars when the market turns tight like a drawn wire. When you depend on a door, the person holding the key doesn't have to threaten you. They only have to go quiet. Retention trigger number 3. Rescue by credit always comes with an invisible clause. You get USD today, but you hand over your future to tomorrow's interest rate. This is where the pressure goes. The fourth link is where petrodollars choose to sleep. Dollar assets, especially US Treasuries. For reserve managers, Treasuries are safe and liquid. A parking place you can exit when you need to. For the United States, it's strategic advantage. When global surpluses flow into Treasuries, America's deficit becomes something the world voluntarily finances. No need to mint more gold. Just make the world treat your debt paper as a standard. And here the money trail closes into a loop. Oil creates dollar surpluses. Dollar surpluses come back to buy treasuries. Treasuries finance the state that issues the dollar. The dollar remains the settlement currency for oil. The system feeds itself on other people's dependence. Retention trigger number 4. In this cycle, energy doesn't just burn in engines. It burns into the structure of global reserves. This is where the pressure goes. The fifth link, the one people miss because it doesn't wear a flag, is the toll collector. When money moves through banks and capital markets, there are always spreads, intermediating fees, and pricing power. Wall Street doesn't need to own oil. It only needs to own the machinery that converts oil revenue into financial assets. And once that machinery becomes standard, it locks both seller and buyer into the same language, USD. And here's where we have to be careful with the fog. The petrodollar pact. If someone promises a document that legally forces Saudi Arabia to sell oil only in dollars, this file demands the evidence. But even without that paper, pricing practice and reserve behavior can still operate like a treaty without signatures, leaving the dollar as expensive, staying as normal. And in politics, the most expensive thing isn't war, it's disruption. Once you see the money trail from the oil invoice to reserve vaults, from reserve vaults to banks, from banks to credit, and from credit into treasuries, you realize what's really being traded isn't oil, it's payment capacity. And once payment capacity becomes a commodity, the question stops being who has oil. It becomes who can make someone else run out of dollars at the worst possible moment. Now we're going to cut into this mechanism in 60 seconds so you can see why it behaves like a weapon without firing a shot. This mechanism can be explained in 60 seconds. Its consequences last for decades. Here it is in the simplest form. When the thing you're forced to buy is priced in USD, you're forced to hold USD. Not because you believe in the dollar. Because without it, you can't pay the bill. Picture a massive city where streetlights and hospitals run on electricity and only one kind of token can switch the power on. You can hate the token. You can argue about it. But every night, before it gets truly dark, you still have to go find it, then lock it away like a survival key. Retention trigger. This isn't the power of a currency. It's the power of the invoice. Now back to the case. After 1971, America lost the gold anchor, the hard promise. But once oil is traded mostly in dollars, the dollar doesn't need gold to make the world hold it. The dollar gains forced demand, created by energy trade. And forced demand has one brutal trait. It doesn't care whether you agree. It only cares whether you pay on time. In a moment, you'll see how that mechanism turns from reserve habit into power leverage. So, the first mechanism isn't a secret deal. It's pipeline design. When a strategic commodity flows through one currency, the entire supply chain has to breathe in that currency. Oil importers have to earn dollars, and to earn them, they either sell goods into dollar markets or borrow inside a dollar-based system. Either way, they enter the same room, the room of dollar liquidity. Inside that room, you're not marked by a flag. You're marked by your ability to repay, and how desperately you need USD. Retention trigger. Oil isn't only energy, it's a payment system. And every payment system has standard setters, toll collectors, and people who start gasping the moment the standard shifts. But if the story stops at oil is priced in dollars, it only creates demand. To turn demand into long-term power, you need the second mechanism, petrodollar recycling. In plain terms, surplus dollars from oil come back to buy dollar assets, especially US Treasuries. Picture a river pouring into the sea, then the tide pulling it back toward the mouth, no one pushing, just the slope being right. The slope here is deep liquidity, relative safety, and market habit. When you're holding too many dollars, you need a place where money can sleep tonight and be awake tomorrow. Treasuries become that standard bed. Retention trigger. The scary part isn't where money goes, it's where money is allowed to go. Back to the case again. From 1974 to 1981, petrodollars swell and circle back into the financial system. You've already seen the route through banks and bond markets. Now comes the weapon piece, when the world's surplus parks in U.S. Treasuries. America's deficit turns into a product the world voluntarily buys. The U.S. doesn't have to persuade with speeches. It only has to supply what the market treats as the default harbor. And once a harbor becomes the standard, money gets pulled into it the way weight pulls a pendulum to one side. This is where the mechanism turns cold. The issuer of the settlement currency doesn't only sell money, it sells the ability to absorb the entire system's surplus. And the system, afraid of instability, usually chooses what it knows best. That's why the debate over was there or wasn't there a binding treaty can become a distraction. A treaty needs paper, but reserve habits and market structure don't need a stamp. They only need time. Retention trigger. The biggest power rarely needs an announcement. It proves itself when everyone obeys and calls it normal. There's one more layer that makes this feel like a weapon. The pipeline doesn't just bring money back, it sends money out again as credit. When petrodollars become bank deposits, international banks turn them into loans, especially to oil importers starving for dollars. The picture looks balanced. Surplus funds, deficit. But the danger sits here. You borrow in a currency you cannot print, and you pay interest on terms you do not control. You can cut budgets, you can tighten belts, but you can't control the price of dollars when the price is set somewhere else. That's why the same mechanism has two faces. When liquidity is abundant, it feels like oxygen. When liquidity tightens, it feels like a noose. And the switch can be triggered by a single lever, U.S. Interest rates surge in the late 1,970 seconds and early 1,980 seconds. Suddenly, dollar debt costs jump, and the vacuum reveals itself as a tightening machine. Retention trigger. A system can look peaceful until the day it changes the terms without warning. At the deepest level, this is why the Middle East isn't just geography. When oil, the thing everyone needs, runs through USD, the thing everyone must have, the two switches sit close together. And when the switches sit close together, monetary policy stops being domestic. It becomes global pressure, seeping into national budgets like smoke into a sealed room. Hold this image, a transparent pipeline running across the world map. Inside it isn't oil, inside it is USD. Oil is just the reason the pipeline exists. And once the pipeline exists, the rest is pressure cycles. Warnings of dollar shortage, borrowing to survive, panic when the cost of capital flips. No question needed to move forward. Just remember one thing. When liquidity changes direction, history starts moving faster. Once the pipeline exists, the first thing that changes isn't the map, it's behavior. Oil importing countries begin living under a new discipline. They stop stockpiling for safety and start stockpiling from fear. Fear of the next shock, fear of the moment a single headline turns an entire budget plan into shredded paper. Markets still call it reserve management. But deeper down, it's a survival reflex in a system forced to breathe in USD. The first escalation step is the warning. It doesn't arrive with sirens. It arrives as small signals, reserves falling faster than expected, energy import costs biting deeper into the balance of payments, closed-door meetings that run past midnight. No one wants to say the one simple sentence because it sounds too weak. We need dollars. In a moment, you'll see why the moment you admit that sentence, you've already stepped into a room where someone else writes the rules. Retention trigger. The frightening part isn't running out of oil. It's running out of the currency that buys oil. The second escalation step is financial action. When reserves aren't enough, the choices become less romantic than any speech. You borrow. The story leaves armored convoys and enters cold conference rooms, paper, signatures, clauses. Petrodollars are sitting inside the banking system, the seller's surplus, and banks are ready to turn that surplus into credit. Syndicated loans appear like a bridge, pulling USD from where it's abundant to where it's scarce, so economies keep turning and invoices keep getting paid on time. But the real pressure isn't having a loan. It's that the loan is priced in USD, the currency whose heartbeat the borrower can't control. You can cut spending, you can raise taxes, you can freeze wages, but you can't order the dollar market to calm down. And when the payment system becomes a weapon, the terms don't have to be cruel. They only have to be market standard. Retention trigger. When you borrow to pay a survival bill, you're not only buying time, you're selling your future at a price no one has announced yet. The third escalation step is panic response, not emotional panic, but technical panic. Everything still runs, but it runs with a hiss. Borrowing countries start depending on rollover. New loans to pay old ones, extended maturities, desperate searches for fresh USD, constant maneuvering to avoid the moment liquidity snaps. On the surface, it's financial technique. Underneath, it's an economy holding itself up by a tightening, wire change, the pull, and the wire becomes a noose. This is where the links reveal their political nature. Because when tension rises, the question stops being who's right. It becomes who still has access to dollars. Oil exporters hold surpluses, but those surpluses sit inside assets that must obey the standard. Banks in the middle hold liquidity, but they allocate it by risk and by market signals. The U.S. holds the currency and the deepest bond market. And that depth has a cost. It turns every global fever into gravitational pull back to the center. Retention trigger. A system can call itself free, but when there's only one door, freedom turns into a line. Throughout all of this, the Joint Commission and the frameworks after mid-1974 play a quiet role. They make the relationship look stable and technical, so the flow of money has a legitimate reason to keep moving. No grand announcements needed. Just structures strong enough that market habit doesn't get interrupted. And that normality is the dangerous part. When the system runs smoothly, people forget it can change speed at any moment. One point here has to stay cold and precise. Some people will try to drag this back to a secret treaty that forces oil through the dollar. This file doesn't do that. If such a binding text exists, it needs a source. But you don't need a piece of paper to lock a system. You only need to make every alternative too expensive. And the fastest way to make it expensive is to tie energy, reserves, and credit into one shared rhythm. Retention trigger. Sometimes power isn't in an order. It's in the fact that every other road leads to pain. And like every pressure machine, it reaches a point where a small change trips the safety switch. In the late 1,970 seconds and early 1,980 seconds, when U.S. interest rates surge, the cost of dollars changes color. Debts that once kept countries alive through the oil bill start turning into a weight that grows with each policy beat. Borrowers see the same picture. They aren't only repaying debt, they're being chased by the price of the currency they're forced to use. No question needed to step into that moment. Just one line to cut the scene. When the dollar becomes more expensive, history doesn't need a war to create casualties. It only needs an interest rate board. Back then, it didn't take an explosion to flip the direction of the whole system. It took a number. In borrowing capitals, a morning began like any other. Reserve reports, debt schedules, the energy import ledger. Then the lines on paper suddenly felt like they were made of lead. U.S. Interest rates surged in the late 1,970 seconds into the early 1,980 seconds. And the dollar became more expensive in the most technical sense of the word. The cost of holding and borrowing USD jumped. Debts that once looked like a bridge over the oil bill turned into a steep, rising slope. No long explanation needed. Everyone understood it by instinct. When the price of the settlement currency rises, everything priced in it starts pressing on your throat. Retention trigger. The breakpoint wasn't not enough oil. It was too expensive dollars. At the operational level, the turn looked almost ordinary. Clauses reset, maturities hit, spreads widened like hairline cracks. But the impact was anything but ordinary. Every dollar loan was a rope. When rates turned, the rope didn't snap, it tightened. Finance ministries watched numbers rise without signing a single new contract. Policy teams stared at the same naked reality. You can cut spending to service the debt, but cut too deep, and the economy stalls. You can keep the economy running, but then the debt swells. The system doesn't need to punish you. It only needs to keep its own rhythm. Inside bank meeting rooms and capital markets, the shift was even colder. When risk rises, credit doesn't slam shut. It closes one notch at a time. Shorter maturities, tighter covenants, higher funding costs. And when dollars grow scarce, the middleman becomes the one who decides who still gets to breathe on liquidity. This is the moment the vacuum reveals the vice. Petrodollars still exist, but the pipeline suddenly has pressure valves, and those valves aren't in the borrower's hands. Retention trigger. When liquidity becomes a privilege, market discipline turns into power. For countries that borrowed in dollars to cover the gap, this was the most ruthless reversal of all. They weren't only paying for oil, they were paying for time. And now time had been repriced. Syndicated loans that once looked like a solution start to look like a net because the harder you struggle, the tighter it pulls. The balance of payments, already worn down by the energy shock, gets bitten again by capital costs. A payment system can trigger crisis in total silence just by making its currency more expensive. The break moment isn't a fireworks event. It's the second a country realizes it's no longer negotiating with the oil seller. It's negotiating with the price of the dollar. And that price is written somewhere else. Hold on to this cold truth as we step into the aftermath. When a currency is your airway, its invoice arrives late, but it always arrives. After the breakpoint, the debris doesn't land evenly. Some countries walk out holding something that still feels like stability. Others walk out with balance sheets carved hollow. But the most dangerous part is this. After every shock, the system doesn't collapse. It learns how to protect itself. The first winner is the issuer of the settlement currency. When oil is traded largely in USD and the surplus dollars flow back into dollar assets, especially US, Treasuries, the United States, gains a structural advantage. Its deficit can be financed as a safe harbor for global reserves. This isn't a treasure buried under sand. It's an operating capacity borrowing cheaper, borrowing easier, inside a deep market where demand is driven by other people's survival habits. The second winner is the class that stands inside the pipeline. International banks and capital markets turn petrodollars into deposits, then into credit, then into asset flows. They take a fee at every step: conversion fees, risk fees, spreads. But more important than the fee is the allocation power. When stress rises, they decide where liquidity goes. They don't need to own oil. They don't need to own wells. They only need to own the financial infrastructure and the standard. And once a standard becomes a habit, the keeper of the standard becomes power. The first losers are the oil importers forced to borrow in dollars just to pay the bill. They lose not only money, but policy space. Every time interest rates and financial conditions turn, they have to react: tighten, cut, roll over debt, trade growth for payment capacity. And the bitter part is this: they aren't doing it to get rich. They're doing it to avoid dying. In a settlement system, survival can be the longest form of defeat. Retention trigger. When you have to pay just to be normal, you're living inside an order someone else defines. The legacy over the next 10 to 30 years isn't a political declaration. It's repeated behavior. Stockpiling dollars as instinct, treating treasuries as the default harbor, watching the dollar market like global weather. And because oil continues to be traded largely in USD, the feedback loop between energy, foreign exchange, and reserves keeps running like a background engine. The longer it runs, the harder it is to replace. Not because alternatives don't exist, but because the cost of exit always feels like another shock. One point here has to stay precise: the petrodollar pact. If someone needs an official treaty to believe the system exists, they're looking in the wrong place. This file does not claim a binding document without sources. But even without it, pricing practice, reserve management, and petrodollar recycling are enough to produce a working order. In the history of power, many of the most effective agreements are written in behavior, not ink. And if you want to see its shadow in the present, look at the way countries track and hold treasuries, the mirror where reserves choose to hide. We don't need the numbers here. The logic is enough. When you hold large amounts of the issuer's bonds, you're storing part of your stability in someone else's hands and tying yourself to the rhythm of their system. Retention trigger. The world isn't locked by iron chains. It's locked by the safest choices. Now that the invoice has been sent, the question isn't who was right. It's what we learn from an order where power lives in the direction of liquidity, the hiding place of reserves, and the silent rewriting of terms. And here's the closing line for the file. The most frightening thing about monetary power is that it doesn't need you to believe. It only needs you to pay. The lesson of this file isn't whether you like or dislike America. It's the rule underneath. Monetary power belongs to whoever turns their currency into someone else's condition for survival. When oil runs through the dollar, the world isn't only buying energy. The world is buying the right to stay normal. And once normal has a price, the seller of the condition holds leverage. If you want to read this century correctly, watch 3 traces: where liquidity flows, where reserves hide, and where agreements get rewritten in silence. Don't listen to promises. Listen for the pressure valve, when dollars become expensive, when credit tightens, when the safe harbor turns into a narrow gate. In the next episodes, we'll follow other airways of global order debt, sanctions, supply chains, to see who has their hand on the switch without ever stepping onto the stage. And if you want more case files like this, subscribe and turn on notifications. History doesn't repeat word for word. It repeats mechanisms.